JaysAnalysis.com. Thank you for listening. Welcome back. This time we're going to do a little bit different setup. I know I said that we would immediately go back to Plato, but I came across something too good before getting back to Plato. And I had a lot of questions come up this week through comments, emails, messages on Facebook and Twitter. After I asked, I took a tally of what people would like to hear more of, see more of, and the responses were all over the place, but there were quite a few that were questioning about philosophy, and they'd like to see more dealing with religion, philosophy, theology, and the relationship between all these. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk about a TED Talk that a guy gave, and I thought it would be illustrative, but it's not going to be just a boring situation where I'm going to play the TED Talk and talk over it. I came across William Lane Craig, the popular apologist's talk, on top of a TED Talk. So I'm going to talk on top of Craig's talk on top of a TED Talk. So there'll be a lot of talking, but it's going to be illustrative because we're going to have two different sides to look at here, with the Jim Holt, who's a New York Times writer who writes on philosophy, science, and religion, who gave a TED Talk on theism and his own personal perspective, which ends up in the talk ends up being kind of a jokey situation. He kind of doesn't take it very seriously, which is not that big of a deal. It's, you can make a jokey discussion and talk if you want to, but the talk doesn't really address the initial question that he lays out from Leibniz. And so William Lane Craig responded with about a 40-minute talk on top of that, where he gives his apologetic responses. And I think it's going to be illustrative because William Lane Craig represents sort of the classical model of philosophical apologetics. Craig offers different versions of classical arguments, like the Ontological Argument or Cosmological Argument. So it's going to be, it will be illustrative in that we will see the apologetic methodology that I think is much better and more coherent, more consistent, much better argument will actually be made by me, in contrast to Craig and the other guy, Jim Holt, who's more, I don't even know what to describe his perspective as. It's just kind of a agnostic / devolution, entropy, worst possible world scenario. It's hard to know exactly what he's getting at in his talk, as you'll see, but nevertheless, it will be illustrative to see a distinction between myself, Jim Holt, and William Lane Craig. So I've read William Lane Craig over the years. I've heard different talks that he gives. I like a lot of what he says. He does have good arguments and good points here and there. I've learned from him. I've read Reasonable Faith. But nevertheless, one's theology can't be divorced from one's apologetic. Okay, so the way that we go, because theology is ultimately encompasses all areas of life, we can't have a philosophy or an apologetic that is divorced from or not informed by or consistent with our theology. And so one of the main problems I have with the classical models of apologetics is that they are not consistent with good theology. In other words, they begin from premises concerning human anthropology and logic and metaphysics, epistemology, etc., that are not consistent with what a person who believes in, say, biblical theology professes. So we have to be consistent, because if we think that God is actually God and who he reveals himself as, we can't devise an apologetic methodology, even with good intentions, that is based on bad arguments or flawed arguments or an apologetic methodology does not comport with, like I said, our given theology. I, of course, I lean very much towards. I attend an Eastern Orthodox church, and I would class myself as a traditionalist of that theological bent. So that's the perspective I'll be coming from for those who are wondering, well, which strand of theology are you coming from? And this is also distinct from Roman Catholic theology, and it's distinct from Protestant and evangelical theology. So myself, having had a pretty good trek throughout my 20s and 30s across these different spectrums and testing them out and visiting different churches, being Roman Catholic for a while, growing up evangelical, attending a Calvinist seminary for a while, I've had a good buffet approach to all this, and so I think that I'm uniquely informed, I guess you could say, in order to be in a position where I can comment on this. I think trying to be fair to all the different sides and the different views, but I really do think that Eastern theology is unique. I think it presents a perspective that harmonizes things better, makes more sense, and even though the argument of what I'm going to present as a transcendental argument is more of something that Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen pioneered, the argument itself is not confined to or limited to Calvinistic theology. So we see this kind of argumentation elsewhere, for example, in Dr. Philip Sherrard's article, Logic and the Absolute, and in Dr. Philip Sherrard's other article, Tradition and the Traditions. He presents a transcendental argument for God in opposition to philosophy and world religions. So we're going to be talking about a lot of that, the philosophy of the absolute. We're going to be talking about classical arguments, and we're going to be talking about William Lane Craig's discussion. So this will get relatively deep, and I had some readers and listeners who requested more deep stuff, so that's good. That's where I'd like to go. We want to forge new ground and not spend all of our time on the basics. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. We're going to start with letting William Lane Craig introduce the Jim Holt guy and what they're going to be talking about, and then I'm going to chime in here and there. The first half of this talk will, of course, be free to anyone. The second half will be for paid subscribers, and so that's how I am working on making a living. So it's beginning to go well. So if you enjoy this kind of stuff, please tell your friends about jaysanalysis.com. So here's William Lane Craig discussing the topic of meaning and nothingness. So this is going to relate as well to my article that I've done on creation, philosophy of creation that I did, and philosophy of creation, Darwinian evolution, and the absolute, as well as an older article that I did about scientism and one of Philip Sherrard's articles about the harmony of science. So a lot of topics we're going to discuss today. Philosophy of science, theology, all of it. So here's William Lane Craig explaining this talk.
Philosopher Jim Holt, who writes for New Yorker, New York Times, writes about science and philosophy. And you'll love this. Why is there something rather than nothing? Who was it that originally said that?
Well, that was Leibniz's question. He said it's the most fundamental question and the very first question which should be asked. Why is there something rather than nothing? That is to say, why does anything at all exist?
In fact, Jim Holt calls this the sublime question of all. Let's listen to some audio and interact.
Why does the universe exist? Why is there a world? Okay, all right. This is a cosmic mystery. Be solemn. Why is there a world? Why are we in it? Why is there something rather than nothing at all? I mean, this is the super ultimate why question. So I'm going to talk about the mystery of existence, the puzzle of existence, where we are now in addressing it, and why you should care. And I hope you do care. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said that those who don't wonder about the contingency of their existence, of the contingency of the world's existence, are mentally deficient. All right, that's a little harsh, but still. So this has been called the most sublime and awesome mystery, the deepest and most far-reaching question man can pose. It's obsessed great thinkers. Ludwig Wittgenstein, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, was astonished that there should be a world at all. He wrote in his Tractatus, Proposition 4.66, it is not how things are in the world that is the mystical, it's that the world exists.
He's off with a bang there, but did you hear the audience's reaction that when he introduced his topic, they began to laugh? Because it's such a big question, and what is he supposed to give the answer now at the TED conference?
Makes me wonder what went before, whether or not there was something that had prejudiced them about asking a question.
How much grease is on French fries? I don't know, because now he's really going to the sublime question. Anybody, after hearing him quote those philosophers, has got to care and say, this is not a question that you can bypass.
And if you don't like taking your epigrams from a philosopher, try a scientist. John Archibald Wheeler, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, the teacher of Richard Feynman, the coiner of the term black hole. He said, I want to know, how come the quantum? How come the universe? How come existence? And my friend Martin Amis, by the way, I'll be doing a lot of name dropping in this talk, so to get used to it. My dear friend Martin Amis once said that we're about 5 Einsteins away from answering the mystery of where the universe came from. And I no doubt there are 5 Einsteins in the audience tonight. Any Einsteins? Show of hands? No Einstein. Okay. So this question, why is there something rather than nothing? This sublime question was posed rather late in intellectual history. It was towards the end of the 17th century. The philosopher Leibniz, who asked it, very smart guy Leibniz, was invented the calculus independently of Isaac Newton at about the same time. But for Leibniz, who asked, why is there something rather than nothing, this was not a great mystery. He either was or pretended to be an Orthodox Christian in his metaphysical outlook. And he said, it's obvious why the world exists, because God created it. And God created it indeed out of nothing at all. That's how powerful God is. He doesn't need any pre-existing materials to fashion a world out of. He can make it out of sheer nothingness, creation ex nihilo. And by the way, this is what most Americans today believe. There's no mystery of existence for them.
Has he characterized Leibniz's view?
The only thing that I'm a little puzzled about would be his claim that Leibniz didn't think this was a difficult question, that it was easy to answer. When you read Leibniz's work, I don't get that impression that he cavalierly says, this is a simple question. He gives a fairly detailed argument as to why the ultimate reason for the existence of the universe cannot be found in the universe itself, in any part of the universe, or in prior states of the universe, and therefore must be found in a transcendent being beyond the universe. So it's not a sort of quick fix for an easy question. Leibniz, I think, wrestled seriously with the question.
He's saying now that most of the American population believe
God made it. Okay, so let's put this in an equation. I don't have any slides, so I'm going to mime my visuals, so use your imaginations. So it's God plus nothing equals the world. Okay? Now, that's the equation. And so maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you're a scientific atheist or an unscientific atheist, and you don't believe in God. And you're not happy with it. By the way, even if we have this equation, God plus nothing equals the world, there's already a problem. Why does God exist? God doesn't exist by logic alone unless you believe the ontological argument. I hope you don't, because it's not a good argument.
Whoops.
Now, I have to stop here because even though William Lane Craig will make some good points about what this guy just said, there's a lot to unpack already. First thing I want to say is that you'll notice that the tendency for those who do not believe in theism or biblical theism, personal God of Scripture, the triune God, what they tend to do is they will characterize the theist, and this they're differing reasons for why this is. They are, most of the time, those who are of that bent are not informed on theology, so they don't have a good idea of what biblical theology actually teaches. They have just sort of, buffet picked up a little bit here and there, bits and pieces, nuggets of what biblical theology teaches, classically at least. So they're usually in the dark, and so the characterizations that they have of who God is and what God is going to be crucial, because it's always something very strange or bizarre. It's always a mischaracterization or a straw man for the most part, and especially amongst atheists, you'll find this, that they always view God as in some sort of anthropomorphic way, and this is ironic because they have such a problem with believers going to the Bible and citing this or that text, and they'll say, oh, well, you view God like this big old man with a white beard in the sky, and that's not at all what theology says about God. Nevertheless, that's actually, ironically, the characterization that non-theists, atheists especially, have of who God is. So that's the first thing to note, is that they take a very creaturely view of God. Now, if in the biblical narrative we have an explanation for why they do that, and we believe that man is fallen, and as a result of that fall, man is subject to death, corruption, and the passions. Okay, and this doesn't mean passion in the sense of like you have a passion for your girlfriend. This means passions in the sense of disordered desires. Okay, so think of the sins of greed, envy, so forth. These are disordered desires that have resulted from the fall. They're not natural to us. They're unnatural in that they're out of whack. Okay, so this is why we would say that fallen man is raised in a way to be a kind of rebel. Okay, so he's born with this principle of destruction already in him that leads him to even from an early age want to rebel. And so he wants there to be no God. He wants there to be no absolute truth, no objective truth, because he is a son of Adam, and Adam fell, and all of his descendants with him. And so as a result, people that have a problem with theism or with this kind of theology, their minds are clouded, we believe. And so it's clouded because of these passions and because of rejection of God's law. And that leads to a creaturely, idolatrous misinterpretation of God. And so it's only natural, I'm using natural in a colloquial sense here, not in a philosophical sense, it's only natural that they would view God as a sort of, in an anthropomorphic way, like some tyrant or some mean guy up in the sky or something. And so that's what they always characterize God that way. God's always viewed as, when you talk to people, well, the God of the Old Testament is this, vengeful, evil guy, and then Jesus is the nice, hippie, cool guy. None of that's true. None of that is at all matches up with the way God's presented in Scripture. If we read the book of Leviticus, God is described as the God of love. So David's Psalms describe God as a loving God. So these are just more pop culture, popular mischaracterizations than they are actual correct notions of what we say. So that's the first point I want to say. The second point is that you'll notice that Jim Holt says we are only 5 Einsteins away from answering where the universe came from, quoting somebody to the effect that science will be able to present eventually the answers to the questions that we have. The next mischaracterization is that creationists don't believe in mystery. They believe that they already have an easy answer. Well, neither of these are true. The first thing is it shows that the atheism or the agnosis or the scientism position is just as much a faith-based commitment as the other. And a faith-based commitment does not mean irrationalism or fideism, as if there aren't logical and consistent reasons for believing what we do. Fideism is a irrational leap. Okay, so there's no reason to believe in X, Y, Z, but perhaps through emotional manipulation we believe it, or some other means or motivation. That's what fideism is. But what it shows is that the tendency amongst these types of people, especially if we look at somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, you'll see them talk about how science will eventually give these answers. Okay, now granted, so as I've said many times, science does give us answers, but it's answers about the natural world. But answers about the natural world can never go beyond the natural world. So you'll never. It's almost like a loop. Okay, so you're never going to get something beyond the physical realm from merely looking at and studying the physical realm. So ironically, the scientistic view is exactly the same as the classical apologist's error. Okay, and what you're going to see that right in this next part where William Lane Craig talks about defending the ontological argument. The problem with the ontological argument is not that it seeks to philosophically defend a transcendent or higher realm. The problem is that it has a bad starting point. It starts from a bad presupposition about the God that it's defending. So it's not that the problem that there's a logical error in the constructing of the argument or in any of the different steps of the argument. It's that the argument begins from a false presupposition about anthropology and about who God is and how we know God. That's the problem. Now, we're going to see that with Craig, but I think it was illustrative. It's important to point out that Craig will make the same error in his starting point in presenting an ontological argument as well as his cosmological arguments that the agnostic atheist guy makes in believing that eventually we can get an answer simply by studying the natural world. Let's see again. The classical arguments, all of them, have one thing in common, and that is that they start from empirical or philosophical presuppositions about the natural world, be it causality with the cosmological argument, design with the teleological argument, or being with the ontological argument, and then we reason up. We sort of stock up on top of that the idea that maybe there's a God up there who's at the source of all this. Why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because it's not possible to start with a generic philosophical concept like being or design that does not already have an entire worldview that informs the meaning of that term or that phrase. Okay, so there's no such thing as design or being that operates on its own independently as some sort of clear force that we can first encounter or know before we know about God. Right? So if we think about the way Paul talks in Romans 1, he says that God has made it evident upon all men's hearts that he exists, and that's why idolatry is universally wrong. So even people say that they've never heard of God or biblical theology or the Bible or whatever, in biblical theology, because man's made in the image of God, God is stamped on his heart from the get-go. And even though man's in rebellion, there is still that inner part, that inner nous that's still there in man that informs him and tells him and is his conscience, letting him know that it's not right to do these things. And that's how Paul can say that even pagans are in some sense still guilty of things like idolatry. So there's no man in the world that is sinless who's a son of Adam. It's inescapable. Now, that is important for apologetics, because what that means is that our intellect, our nous, whoever we are, is in some sense darkened, and so it needs enlightenment and revelation from the divine, from God, in order to reason appropriately and correctly. So man's reasoning is darkened, Paul says, and he later says in Acts 17 that when they talk about God, it's the unknown God. So this is when Paul's doing apologetics to the philosophers in Athens in Acts 17. He tells them that you actually still have knowledge and remembrance of God, but you call him the unknown God because you don't know him. And that's the point here, is that so someone like Jim Holt, who does not know theology and does not believe in the kind of God that we do, there's still a remnant or a spark of who God is in his mind, in his nous, in his soul, his heart. But that has been clouded and darkened by the passions and by error and so forth, by being boxed into the prison of this world and the things of this world. And so we can thus see that the apologetic methodology that is still based around looking at creatures and then reasoning up to God is inappropriate for determining or proving that kind of God. Now, that doesn't mean that the created world doesn't show the evidence of a designer. It does. But that's not the type of apologetical argumentation that is going to prove or demonstrate to an unbeliever, to an atheist, that this view is correct. And the reason for that is because the problem is not a lack of evidence, and that's the key here. All of the evidential classical approaches view man as if he were this sort of neutral being who could, in a courtroom setting, put God on trial and decide, okay, well, bang, bang, bang the gavel, I've determined that you do exist based on this much evidence. Or bang, 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 the verdict is you do not exist. Guilty, not guilty. Neither of those approaches is consistent with the way that theology presents God. And that's the key here. So as an apologist, as a person who believes, it's not only is it a better argument, you need an apologetic that's consistent with the theology that you have. And the theology that we have, if you look at the way Paul preaches in Athens, especially Acts 17, he doesn't present God as a being for whom the philosophers of Athens have the right and the privilege to judge whether or not he exists. Paul presupposes God's existence and preaches as if that existence is absolutely certain and can be known and is testified in their very heart and in the very fabric of creation, and says that you have the obligation to believe this, and if you don't, well then that's your decision. Those are the consequences that you have to deal with. But you see that Paul does not take the approach of William Lane Craig, nor does he take the approach of any of the other classical arguments. He doesn't spend hours doing in-depth philosophical analysis trying to put forth boatloads of evidence. And again, that's not to say that boatloads of evidence are bad or that you can't do boatloads of evidence. But the key is that understanding that the person who does not believe or is not enlightened to these things, they have rose-colored glasses. So they have a interpretive framework by which they will already explain away any of these kinds of evidences. Okay, that's why the resurrection argument that classical apologists try to make is not a good argument. And why? Well, that's not to say that it's wrong to believe in resurrection, but rather that just saying, well, somebody was raised from the dead and the apostles acted different after the resurrection, that's not a good argument. Because there could be all kinds of reasons for why a person changes their, attitude after somebody was raised from the dead. Or maybe it was a fluke. Maybe Jesus just, fell asleep for 3 days and was in a coma or something, and they thought he was dead. Now, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying that that's not a good argument. And anybody who, has basic logic and basic reasoning, is going to be able to pick those kinds of arguments apart. So we have a duty, I think, to be coherent and consistent in our reasoning, as well as having our reasoning be consistent with the theology that we hold to. So we'll go ahead and get back to Craig here, where he tries to then go into why he thinks the ontological argument works.
Yeah, now, when he says God doesn't exist by logic alone, we need to distinguish between strict logical possibility and what philosophers call broad logical possibility. There's no strict logical impossibility in saying that there is an unmarried bachelor. Those aren't strictly contradictory, but it is broadly logically impossible to say that there's a married bachelor. Or to give a different example, to say that the prime minister is a prime number involves no logical contradiction, but it's nevertheless broadly logically impossible, that is to say, capable of being actual. So those who believe that God is the explanation of the contingent universe would admit that the proposition God does not exist does not contain a logical contradiction. But they would nevertheless say that the proposition God exists is logically necessary in this broad sense.
There you go. That's the problem. That's the root of it right there. Now, if you don't see the distinction there, then you've kind of missed what I've been saying, what I've been trying to advance and advocate in terms of apologetics. When Craig says that there's no strict logical contradiction in saying that God does not exist, that is the fundamental area of disagreement that we would have. Why does he say this? Because of what I've been saying before. The idea that classical apologetics presents different kinds of, what's the word I'm looking for? It presents, it'll say things like, we're 98% certain that God exists, or you can be 99.9% certain, or something like that. Or, we can have all of these indicators that point to God, but there's no certain evidence that God exists. And why that is, different answers are given. Most of the time when you say, no, there is an absolutely certain proof for God's existence, the response for most people is, well, that can't be, because if there was certain proof, then everybody would be a theist. Well, no. That ignores the fact that men are fallen and the fact that humans don't believe things based on reason most of the time. Reasoning is clouded and darkened by the fall, and it's just astonishing to me that Craig doesn't see that. I mean, to say that there's no contradiction in the phrase God does not exist is essentially to say that God is not the groundwork and framework for logic itself. Okay, it treats logic as if it were this objective power or force out there that has no relation or connection to God ultimately as its framework. Now, I'm sure that if we were to really quiz Craig about that, he would say, well, yeah, I do think that God does exist and that he is logically necessary, because he will give a version of the ontological argument where he thinks that God is broadly logically necessary, but not strictly, formally logically necessary. And this is where we would differ. Again, the presentation that we read, say, in someone like Maximus the Confessor, the Eastern theologian, who was instrumental in the formulation of Christology, the doctrine of who Jesus is, at later ecumenical councils. Maximus talks about the logoi, or the fundamental seeds or archetypes or principles behind things, and how all of creation exhibits this rationality, this logic, because it is a manifestation of the logos. Okay, the logos that created the logoi of creation. That means that human reasoning, human logic, is grounded in the divine. It can't be separated from it. So the reasoning that you do is after God. You reason after, in other words, the things that you learn about the natural world, that you discover, the only way that you can learn and discover those things is because there's an omniscient, omnipotent, divine mind that grounds those things, and as well as grounding your reason. So it's not possible to reason apart from God. That's the point. Reasoning itself presupposes that kind of God, and that's the key. That is the Transcendental Argument. And so for Craig to say that it's logically possible for God not to exist is to ultimately admit that logic is an area in which God is not ultimately supreme. Again, it's an inconsistency, because I'm sure that if we were to ask him personally, he would think that God does rule logic.
It's not strictly logically necessary, and that its denial doesn't involve a contradiction, but it is broadly logically necessary. God is a necessary being.
God is a necessary being. Okay, so it's treated in the generic being in the ontological argument reasons up to generic God, and that's why it's a bad argument. It's not a bad argument in the steps of the process itself. It's a bad argument in the theology it presents, and it presents a deformed, bizarre view of some generic deity. We don't believe that God is a generic deity. The generic deity that Paul talks about in Acts 17 is the one that he rebukes the Greek philosophers for speculating about. The God presented in Scripture is I am that I am, not I am being. And that's the big distinction that we would have with Thomism. That's why Thomism doesn't work, is because when it talks about Exodus 3:14, when God says I am that I am, Thomas speculates that this is I am being. I am perfect fullness and plenitude of being. This is a Greek philosophical concept. It's not the same thing as the Hebrew concept of who God is. God is a personal being with whom you have a relationship. Being in the generic Greek philosophical concept is not a personal force with which you have any kind of relationship. So this is a holdover, still an idea that we have from Greek philosophy, that we can blend theology with Greek philosophy in order to make it applicable and acceptable to those who do not believe or do not understand. And that's the big flaw here. Now, again, Craig is going to say, yeah, but it's still not a logical contradiction to say God does not exist. Well, actually it is, because logic itself is the transcendental argument for God. That's the whole point. And that's what people have a very hard time understanding or grasping, how this argument works. But the argument is such that in order to have logic, in order for there to be consistency, you need the deity presented in Scripture. Not just an impersonal force, not just an impersonal Greek category, but you actually need the full attributes of the deity presented in the Bible. And that's what's crucial. And it is a logical argument. It is consistent, and it is certain. And it's not just certain psychologically, it's certain from an objective, logical perspective. And you can actually write it out in a logical form. For example, Gödel's incompleteness theorems, although they're not directly talking about God, they are logical form versions of a transcendental argument. So when he talks about set theory not being able to prove its own internal consistency with itself without appealing outside of the set, he's giving you the form of a transcendental argument. See? And so in the same way, you can make a universal claim about logic itself not being able to justify itself. It has to appeal outside of itself to show its own internal consistency. And the only way to do that, to show how that works, not just in abstract conceptual arenas, but in the world and in minds and across time, is if you have a divine mind which encompasses all these things. And that's ultimately the Transcendental Argument. And that requires a being who's omniscient, omnipotent, etc., etc. All the different attributes that are ascribed to God.
In that sense. So his claim about logic needs to be nuanced somewhat. And particularly with respect to the ontological argument, the claim of contemporary proponents of the argument would be that God is broadly logically necessary and that this is possible. And if it is possible, then that means that God exists.
By the way, Bill, I like the way that he put it correctly. That is, why does the universe exist? Why does God exist? Because that would be, he didn't ask where did God come from or who made God, which is the typical move.
Right.
But he did follow Leibniz there, which would be a legitimate question.
Right. That's a very good point, Kevin. And he posed the question correctly.
And Leibniz's answer is, well, there are only two kinds of being. There's necessary being and there's potential being. And so, but he didn't like the ontological argument. Let's see if he continues.
Okay.
So, it's conceivable if God were to exist, he might wonder, I'm eternal, I'm all-powerful, but where did I come from? Whence then am I? God speaks in...
Interesting point there with Holt, because Holt, you see, is saying the same thing well, there's a connection between the way Holt is talking about God and the way that Craig will talk about God in terms of the ontological argument. Because what Holt is going to do is say what he does what I said earlier. He anthropomorphizes God and views God like a man sitting around pondering and reasoning, from one supposition to the next. Where did I come from? As if this was some, wise insight. People have been making this dumb joke forever, That's not who we say God is. And this is why what's called apophatic theology is so important, and why it's very distinct from the presentation that Craig will give and the presentation that Holt will give. When we talk about God, we talk about God as He's revealed to us. And we believe that God reveals Himself to us, primarily in Scripture, but also in our hearts and in nature. But the revelation in Scripture is what corrects a lot of our erroneous notions that we might derive from God through nature because of our darkened minds. Okay, so Scripture is special in that it gives us a clearer picture of who God is, as well as the revelation that we have in the tradition of the church. So God is not something that we reason about and speculate and figure out about. Okay, so this is not a God is not like a feature of the natural world, and this is what's crucial. Paul makes that very clear in Acts 17, where he says the divine nature is not like anything made with human hands. That's very crucial, because that's in line with Moses. When Moses talks about God, he says that you can't image Him, you can't make pictures of Him, you can't find any kind of creaturely analog that is an accurate representation of the divine nature. That's crucial. And so in Orthodox theology, we don't hold the belief that God can be known in His nature. Okay, so you'll hear atheists, and there's a talk that Neil deGrasse Tyson gave one time where he's saying, when you talk about this God, I want to know what the nature of this thing is. What is this thing you're talking about? Again, the approach here is illustrative. Tyson's approach itself is illustrative of the error of man's thinking, because the being that we're talking about is a being whose nature you cannot know. simply by the fact that it's infinite, it's omniscient, it's omnipresent, it's omnibenevolent, and these are categories that as finite beings we don't know or understand apart from Him revealing Himself to us. And that's what's crucial. And we believe that we do know God personally, but we do not know His essence or nature. And that's key, because all pagan reasoning, all fallen reasoning seeks to characterize or encapsulate God and his essence as a kind of thing, a category of other things. Trees, birds, plants, God. And they all have being in differing degrees. Okay, this is one of the central problems of Thomism. But William Lane Craig, in his philosophical evangelical approach, has the same error as the Greek philosophers and as the atheists and the pagans in viewing God as just one other type of thing or category. We do not believe that. It's okay to talk about God as a being, but that word itself is just used in a very generic or very categorical sense and is very misleading, because God is not just one thing or the top of all the things that characterize being or existing things. God's nature is radically different from the nature of created things and the things that exist in our world and from humans. And because God's nature is so radically different, it's impossible to encapsulate or image the divine nature. Now, God's powers and presence, or what we call energies, or His operations in the world, these things are seen and are imaged. But it's very important to make these distinctions, because these are the distinctions in theology that keep us from making the kinds of errors that Jim Holt and, unfortunately, William Lane Craig will make, still lurking around in his theology. God is radically different from creation. Now, that doesn't mean that we're therefore deists and we think that God has no relation to the created world. On the contrary, God is everywhere present in the created world, and that's the other flip side of the problem for Craig and his TED Talk guy, Jim Holt, is that they don't understand that because God is intensely immanent as well as transcendent, that all reasoning is ultimately founded and grounded in the divine. And the logoi in creation are the things that we're ultimately learning and seeing and understanding, even though we have the veil of the material, quote, material realm. We are not able to see things as they truly are unless we are enlightened by God. And that's why we have such a radically different view. We believe that God has enlightened us through Scripture and through the tradition of the church and through the teachings of the fathers, which is, correct philosophy, and ultimately through the grace and divine light that's given. And that's why it's so hard for these people to grasp it, is that they've not been given the revelation of these mysteries, which is ultimately a gift from God. Now, I don't mean that in a Calvinistic sense, because we do participate in this process and exchange. But again, that's the crucial error here, is just a big difference in theology about what we say about God. And a good model or image to use is if we talk about Georg Cantor, the mathematician. Cantor talked about a bunch of different infinities. Okay, so these different infinities can be modeled, with different symbols, and you can have a set of one infinity, and then if you raise it to the power of 1, then you have yet another infinity, but they're not the exact same. Well, you could do this infinitely, raising the sets infinitely, and so Cantor proved that there is Aleph naught, or the infinity of infinities, the absolute infinity. So we can talk about these things, and we know that they're mathematically true, but we don't have any direct, empirical, creaturely analog to what that kind of existence or being is. So even though Cantor is talking in generic mathematical terms, in theology we would say that absolute is not just an impersonal force or number. It's actually a personal, living God.